recording. And our correlating theme today will be about the psychological effects on black people, mainly in dealing with incarceration, education, economics, and cultural behaviors, both physically and mentally. Now, throughout historical civilizations of the past and present, laws have been used to provide structure to members of society within those civilizations. Laws have and continue to evolve to adapt to different conditions people encounter, and in an attempt to bring order, safety, and peace. However, this presentation will address how the evolution of laws can be manipulated and applied to the detriment of certain people, more so people of African descent. Got ahead of myself a little bit. And also many laws that have been applied to encourage what is white supremacist ideology to maintain the psychological effect of inferiority among black people. And the psychological effects can be correlated to the themes of this presentation: incarceration, education, economics, and various cultural behaviors within black communities. Now we're going to start with establishing the foundation, which the foundation of the laws in this country is the U.S. Constitution, where the 3/5 human clause was for representation for taxation, and the foundation of every law existing within the United States is built on the U.S. Constitution. Now, with the first article of this document beginning with this ideology of 3/5 human being, starts to build on the foundation of the degradation of an inferior ideology towards black people in written government documents. And if the foundation of the ideology towards black people in these legal documents starts with black inferiority, the counter ideology would be establishing white superiority, thus causing every subsequent law created and established to maintain and foster these ideas of inferiority and versus superiority. Now, you have the era of slavery. During slavery, of course, we know the Willie Lynch letter he gave a speech in 1712, and it provided to slave owners as a methodology of making a slave, which the letter describes tactics of slaves being self-controlled. These tactics caused differences to be highly recognized between slaves. Black people were using these tactics were used so that black people would create division amongst themselves. And Willie Lynch stated that properly implementing these methods would control slaves for at least 300 years. Now, many of these tactics described in the Willie Lynch letter have an effect on many generations of black persons, both prior to and after slavery being abolished. These differences continue to play a role in modern-day society because of differences noted within education, affluence, skin complexion, texture of hair, etc., to be further discussed in the modern era of this presentation. Now, the Dred Scott case of 1857 is another document within the legal arena that maintains this inferior-superior ideology. And Chief Justice Taney wrote that no Negro, free or slave, could claim U.S. citizenship, and therefore Negroes were unable to petition the court for their freedom. This decision was nearly 70 years after the ratification of the United States Constitution. Moving forward, you go to the Emancipation Proclamation, which during President Abraham Lincoln was the president during the Civil War, which he signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. However, Lincoln's motives were were not in freeing the slaves to free the slaves. It was rather a war tactic for the Union to prevail over the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in Confederate states, not the Union states that had slaves, and this was mainly due to Union states would having had succeeded in joining the Confederacy. Now, moving forward, and this also gives a little more information about the Emancipation Proclamation's history. Many slaves were unaware of the Proclamation of 1863, and the last slaves to be informed were in 1865 in June, and it's commonly towards the end of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th. But June 19th is celebrated as Juneteenth because that exact date was not known when all the slaves found out of their freedom. Now, we go forward to the Reconstruction era, and you have established the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, where the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for punishment of crime. The 14th Amendment established citizenship, equal protection, and due process clauses, and the 15th Amendment established the right to vote without regard to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The effects of these amendments will be discussed further in the modern era of this presentation. Now, I would like to note in this slide that voting regarding to the grandfather clause was enacted in many southern states in between times of 1895 and 1910 to deny the right to vote to African Americans, and was another means to prevent black people from voting. And although the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the 1915 in a ruling in 1915 that the grandfather clause was unconstitutional because it violated equal voting rights of the 15th Amendment, it wasn't really enforced until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And there are still today effects that isn't completely enforced, just how district lines are drawn in certain ways. But moving forward, you have during the Reconstruction era, labor unions were created because many white workers were having harder times finding employment because freed black people were the more skilled workers. And would like to bring a note to sharecroppers, where if they didn't really have a means once to leave the plantation, so the plantation owners would allow the freed slaves to stay on the land, and just using this as a hypothetical, you can stay here for $10 a day, but we're going to pay you $2 a day. And that debt accumulation, they were never able to work their way off of the plantation. Now, you go forward to Jim Crow laws, which were really enacted after the Reconstruction period. And these laws were enacted and mandated racial segregation and established separate but equal. And in 1896, you have the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld the separate but equal clause as being constitutional. And this holding of Plessy came nearly 110 years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, and about 33 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet the court's decision blatantly continues to foster this idea of inferior, superior ideology for the degradation of black people. And Jim Crow laws would be in full effect until more action and attention was brought to the injustices occurring leading up to and throughout the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And in dealing with and speaking about the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, you have two landmark cases which are often associated as being 1, but you have Brown versus the Board of Education 1, holding that separate but equal was not constitutional. And also in Part 2, you have the court ruling that immediate desegregation should be enacted, although that did not occur. And I would like to note that in Louisiana, part of that not occurring was that there was a case 2 years after Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 where the court in New Orleans ruled that the school board should have an effective plan to desegregate the public schools in New Orleans, and that was highly opposed. But after 4 years, the school board finally enacted a plan to integrate the city's public schools in 1960, and there were 4 girls who integrated those schools: Leona Tate, Tessie Prevost, Gail Etine, and Ruby Bridges. And there were riots that occurred after the integration. And the student enrollment at the 2 desegregated schools declined as parents chose to enroll their children in private schools. Moving to the modern era, after the civil rights era, which I wish I could touch more on that, but trying to bring the correlation in totality. And after the civil rights era, the 1950s and 60s, the war on drugs and the war on poverty were created. However, these wars are not on tangible drugs or the high-level leaders of drug cartels or the lack of economic resources. The main expenditure of money is spent locally and against the people who are stereotypically associated with drugs and poverty and local neighborhoods where these people reside. Now, you have a tactic, one of many, with Terry stops, which is a controversial issue because Terry stops allow law enforcement officers to seize a person based on a reasonable suspicion. This tactic harbors inferior-superior ideology because it stems to the slave era culture where runaway slave patrols could target black people, free or enslaved, to inquire where and why that person is at the present location, where the person is going, and why the person is going there. Furthermore, if a runaway slave patrol agent did not like a response or the conduct of the black person could easily have been killed or go missing, which many runaway slave patrols were local vigilante groups who organized themselves to hunt and capture enslaved black persons who ran away in hopes of obtaining freedom. Terry stops also foster the slave patrol ideology because it allows an organized vigilante group to stop a person for any reason that gives a modern law enforcement officer a reason to suspect something and make unjustified inquiries with legal support. And which the war on drugs and the war on poverty allows people to be targeted through these Terry stop tactics. Much crime involving drugs and being impoverished leads to incarceration, causing more difficulty in finding a job to obtain a legitimate source of money. Now, harder times finding employment causes a higher likelihood of recidivism or reoffending because of the need to obtain money to provide for human needs. The increase in recidivism causes more money to be spent to combat drugs and poverty and the people stereotypically associated with these issues. And the overall effect in dealing with these types of issues, it leads to incarceration, which more money being spent on incarceration causes there to be fewer resources in other areas. Now, and those other areas oftentimes include education and legitimate economic means. when there is a lack of educational funding, it causes many underprivileged persons to seek alternative illegal means of obtaining financial income. And once a person becomes a target in the war on drugs or in the war on poverty, the person becomes labeled after being arrested. And whether convicted or not, they still have that label that follows them on the background check. And this leads to more difficulty in finding that meaningful employment, and which leads to first offenses and then reoffending because of that label. Also, offenders have a lack of rehabilitative and educational resources while incarcerated, causing a disconnect with society, being unable to keep up with the changes occurring within modern society, and having a lack of skills once released from being incarcerated. Having a lack of skills causes a person to have a harder time in being a law-abiding citizen because there are less contributions the person is able to make positively in society. And the sky's in plain sight. This compilation of pictures, in the top left is a picture of a runaway slave in a tree. There are dogs at the bottom of the tree, and the runaway slave patrol with their guns on horseback. And one thing you can kind of see as a trend, the bottom right picture is from Ferguson last year after Michael Brown was killed, and the black and white picture is from the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s. And there seems to be a common theme throughout this time in history of U.S. history. Now, I would like to go on and say that these laws have continually evolved throughout history, as well as new developments having been made within the fields of science and social sciences. The laws that have been established, such as duress as being actual or threatened violence or imprisonment inflicted or threatened by another party towards a person, spouse, or child to compel certain action or inaction. Now, I mentioned that's from Black's Law. I mentioned that because indigenous black persons were kidnapped and brought here under duress. And if being brought here under that complex, under those circumstances, you have a complex of Stockholm Syndrome, which is founded in many mental health needs, where Stockholm Syndrome is the psychological effect occurring when a person who may have been kidnapped or a hostage, etc., identifies and or sympathizes with the captor, the kidnapper, hostage taker, etc., as a means of survival. Now, in my personal opinion, this psychological effect of slavery has caused enslaved black people to identify with slave owners as a means of survival, and the tactics of the Willie Lynch letter were adopted by enslaved black people because of a survival method to prevent the slave owner and overseers from carrying out more killings, rapings, beatings, etc. Especially in a modern era that socially better understands the damaging effects of things such as rape and the inescapable torment of continually being in the presence of a rapist and being around the victim having to be subjected to that with no recourse to the rapist. And furthermore, the inferiority the inferiority established by causing an enslaved black man to see his wife be raped and being powerless to stop the violence perpetrated against his wife, and the wife and children seeing the black man held powerless, causing the black man to be looked down upon for the inability to stand up for his family with the present threat of imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or his family. And all these psychological effects are damaging in many ways and further cause separation within the black family unit, with separation within local black communities and among black people across the world. I want to move on also with just a question for food for thought, guise of equality. Why are people afraid to engage in an intellectual conversation with others about race if society is as diverse and tolerant as people misbelieve. Because oftentimes people want to join a conversation to debate points with only to prove why their side is right and the opposing side is wrong, but not actually gaining insight for understanding. Now, the cultural behaviors differences, this is an example of what with corporal punishment still being prevalent in many black households today, where a tactic used during slavery was to instill fear for the Willie Lynch self-regulation of black people. And once we started self-regulating, we can control that in our own household. And going on to post-slave era, black fraternities and sororities using pledging and hazing as a form of initiation, accomplishing two things within that realm: physical and mental reprimands towards initiates, which is a form of corporal punishment. And this division is under a disguise of building bonds, because even if it's within, say, that fraternal or sorority organization, you have differences of paper versus pledge, different fraternity or different sororities having unhealthy rivalry. Now, with the physical and mental reprimands, and this further explains what I was just talking about. Now, you have both of those corporal punishments and, of course, hazing becoming gradually illegal over time. It's been criminalized, but there's been nothing done to change our state of mind regarding those issues. But the 13th Amendment says slavery is abolished except as form of punishment of crime. Now, if the things that we do in our culture is criminal now, but we haven't done anything to change that, it's just a matter of time until we become slaves incarcerated again. And I would put a note there about the legalization of marijuana. It became criminalized, and for decades it's been criminalized, and now the push towards decriminalizing marijuana, which is often associated with the black community stereotypically. You have a push to decriminalize it, but how, I just posed the question, is that going to be applied retroactively for people who are incarcerated on just those types of offenses, which President Obama has declared that several thousand inmates be released for lower level nonviolent drug crimes and whatnot. Now, you also have cultural behaviors mentally, where mental health issues are highly prevalent among all races, cultures, and ethnic groups. Yet, these needs are not addressed properly among anyone, especially if you look at persons incarcerated, but there's little help being done to address those needs. And also within the black community, one being labeled black because of the inferior, superior ideology is already a disadvantage in being black, but then you're labeled as having a mental health disorder, which in the black community is, oh, that person's crazy, and we just a lot of times write them off. But there are needs that need to be addressed. So being labeled twice is really something you're not going to talk about, because I already have this one label that's affecting me. Now, that is the end of that portion of the slideshow, but I do just want to share one last thing with you. And